Hey, folks, welcome back to Talk Track, a Telegraph podcast where we talk about everything that's going on in today's events in the rail industry, really for anybody that's involved in the overall freight rail space in North America. So that could be railroads, shippers, equipment owners, and even third party logistics companies. And so today we're joined by our very own David Carell, who leads our freight market intelligence function. And we're going to be diving in to the second rendition of our Telegraph Market Consist. David, welcome back. How you doing?
I'm very excited to be back with a second report to share and to talk about with you and to share with this audience.
Yeah, look, David, it's the initial cut was fairly broad, and we were wading into some territory that I think other folks gave us feedback on that there wasn't quite a bit there. But in this second rendition, I think that you found a few more levers and trends that are really interesting, especially in the commodity markets. And so I'm candidly really excited to dive into that as well. And so, look, what we're trying to do with the market consist is give the readers some actionable insights around what we perceive to be trends and changes happening in the market over the next 3, 6, 9, and even 12 months. And so the question that I think you and I were asking ourselves as we were kind of rounding the corner on bringing this to town was, what is going to happen in rail in the next 3 to 6 months, considering everything else that's going on? What say you?
Gosh, yeah. Well, I will. I think first it's best if I speak to the output of the quantitative modeling, and then I'd love to get your take on what that means on the ground. Drawing on the many experiences both here at Telegraph and you've had with customers and with carriers, and happy to have that conversation because I think there's more to unpack than we could write in the text, and so conversations like this, give us an opportunity to think more deeply about it. So I think the bottom line, and this speaks to when you were mentioning the goals of the project, we want to say what's going to happen and not sort of hand washing way or hand waving way, excuse me, any sort of vague way. We want to be really rather quantitative and specific about what readers can take away as expectations for the next 3 to 6 months. And I got to say, volume wise, depending on who you ask, it's not great news from what we see. We're projecting carload volumes to be relatively steady Q4, but down 3% in Q1 2026, down 5% in Q2, and intermodal volumes down 5 to 6% in the near term, flattening off towards Q2 2026. And so I think the first thing to think about there is we expect relative underperformance in volume at a national level, carload and intermodal. And the way our modeling works, and as is helpful, we'll get into that, is that then feeds into projections of actually faster service times at the Chicago Gateway Hub as there's just less volume pulling on those resources. So that's a long way of saying we see a shipper's market going into the new year.
And when you kind of think about the broader view of things, and when I say things, I mean volume being depressed. When you kind of looked at some of the factors that are really driving that, where is the pressure coming from that is going to basically keep volumes lower than I think they have been historically when we think about maybe the prior 5 years?
Sure. I think there's two ways to kind of approach that. One is, what do we feel pretty confident is going to underperform last year? And then the second is, when we look for green shoots, what do we see? And so when we think about what we feel pretty confident is going to underperform, I think the story of 2025 was international trade and tariff regimes. And our models take that into account, particularly trade with Canada on the carload side, and trade with China and Mexico on the intermodal side. And, I think we in the world have reason to believe that those trade relationships are not what they once were. Brass tacks, what does that mean in our models? It means that we've taken our seasonal forecast for trade with those trading partners down a few pegs going into the new year. And we think that will give us a more accurate model. And so, the first point, I guess, is internationally, there's a lot of headwind. I think one thing that you could look at and say is, well, yeah, but isn't some of that intended to create tailwinds domestically? Aren't we hoping for domestic growth to replace that. And, maybe that certainly is the intention, but I just don't think from a quantitative point of view, we have reason to expect that in the near term. Some of the things that we were looking at to get a sense of what are manufacturers doing were the production managers index. This time around, we also looked closely at the logistics managers index. Those are both, for people who don't know, diffusion indices of what those managers expect going forward. So a production managers index is basically a survey of production managers' sentiment. What are we purchasing for inputs to be ready for our plans in the next several months?
Right.
They're trending downward. So, I say that in that, as we considered our modeling approach, we had to consider both the headwinds on the international market and the general sort of malaise we observe through the survey data in the domestic market. Those are the things that I think came together to give us these underperforming forecasts.
Right. What's interesting is obviously you set kind of the foundation with the first section. Now with this, we're revitalizing that, and I think you did a lot of additive effort. What's really interesting is we were recording this on the day after CSX released its fourth quarter and full year 2025 kind of financial discussion, and the clearest thing that I took away from that, yes, they pulled guidance. It was a very clear statement. We do not anticipate any meaningful improvement in the macroeconomic conditions in the near term. So I think that's a very interesting piece, and we can definitely talk about that later. Look, one of the things that I've always struggled with as an individual, when I consume macroeconomic forecasts, and oftentimes there is some layering of opinions that, to your word, tends to be very hand wavy. How are we giving something to readers that they can trust? Like how are we kind of like validating the data and the application of that? Give me more there, because I think that's a big question that many people probably have.
No, there's two broad ways to do it, and I appreciate the question so much, because I think we all should be critical readers. If you're reading things that we write, or you're reading things that anyone writes, continuously interrogating that text for should I believe you is 100% what we all should be doing. And so two ways, I hope everyone reads our report. I'm very glad that this is something that we can share with everyone for free. And I hope people take that same interrogation to our work here. And so the two ways I would suggest, we all do that. One is just, plainly doesn't make sense. Do the facts of this story fit together in a way that aligns with the way I think the world works? And then the second one, and we did the legwork for you there, is, well, if you're making a point forecast, we're quantitatively saying this is how much we think will move carload in the U.S. In February and March and April 2026. You can look back and compare our previous forecast to the data that came out after we made the forecast. And we did that for you, and I'm very proud and excited to share that our results were pretty good. 98% accuracy in our carload forecast, 97% accuracy in our intermodal forecasts. But, as you and I have digested those results, we want to be very upfront with ways that people should think about those high accuracy numbers. So yes, it's good. We've plotted them in the report so you can see where we were up and down. But, really, we forecasted, we had 4 months of forecast data come out since we released our forecast. So 4 points of comparison on the intermodal and the carload side. And those are mostly Q3 and one Q4 data point, which is kind of a steady period. So yeah, it's great we got this over 90% accuracy, but to kind of couch that, it's really only 4 points in the data series, and it's during relatively calm waters. I think the real test for our method will be this report going forward, because we see a big dip in January. That's a seasonal dip, but that's real movement on the line chart, so to speak. So if we got that right, I think we'll have even more confidence, and hopefully our readers will have even more confidence going forward. Yeah.
Look, I love the results, but I also love the explanation of how we got to the results. I think one of the really interesting things is that there are always pockets of, I would say, disagreement with how the freight market is going to go. And some of that is based on fundamentals. Some of that is based on desiring people to click certain headlines. But I think one of the things that we've seen is that the truck market has had some undulating thing. There's an idea that the storm coming is going to drastically reshaped freight demand for a long period of time. And there's also been a thought that exports from China heading kind of building up towards Chinese New Year have actually been depressed. And I think there's some initial signs that bookings may be higher than anticipated there. So it'll be interesting to see how all of that plays out. Going back to our methods and approach, one of the things that I always get a little animated about is how are the things made in the kitchen? And is this a situation of, hey, bro, did you just like do AI to like get the things? So tell us a little bit more about how, in non-technical terms, how this all kind of comes together.
No, I'm glad you asked, and I agree with that sentiment so much because we are in a unique point in human history, really, where anyone can go to a large language model and ask any question and get any result. So I think kind of to your earlier point about how do we know what we should trust, that question is even more pressing in our current environment, perhaps than it's ever been. So when we built our forecast, one of the things that was important, I think, philosophically to the team and to you, as you and I discussed it, is like we don't just want a number to come out and then we say, look, it's 40 and walk away. Like we want to know how and why and which ingredients went into that dish and what justifies including those ingredients, if you will. So the way we did that is we said we need two broad buckets of inputs or ingredients, to continue the analogy. One is the time series history. So what is the history of carload movements in the United States? What is the history of intermodal movements in the United States? And then also we spent a lot of time and we put a lot of sort of lab resources to what external data produces good forecasts of those values. So, to contrast that, the hey bro, is it AI approach would be, here's all the data I can download, model, please look at it and then give me a forecast. In that case, you're not really curating the inputs and you don't understand the relationships to the output. We chose not to go that way. We chose to say, let's curate our inputs so we have different, what I would call exogenous factors that feed into our forecasts. For example, for the carload model, that includes things like trade with Canada, U.S. coal production, U.S. steel production, U.S. paper production, things that we know and have rigorously tested how they correlate to carload volumes. Right. And then we use those known ingredients as the inputs to our model. And, for any technical people watching, I don't want to get too technical, but the resulting model is something called a Ceramax formulation with exogenous variables. So it allows us to use the history and the outside information to get a forecast. One more point on that, just because I know everyone is understandably excited about machine learning and AI tools. Why are we using what is essentially a statistical probabilistic measure here when all those other things are out there for free? Because the results are so good. Like right now, we have really good accuracy and we can explain every step. To my mind, if we were not getting good accuracy, then we would start to weigh the benefits of giving up some of the explainability by using some sort of large language model with unknown inputs. But for now, our models have been performing very well, and they've allowed us to understand the results and to also massage them. We were able to say, what does the data tell us to expect for trade with Canada, for example, over the next 6 months? And then we can manually ratchet that down and say, but what if the relationship gets worse, and see the results? And we're able to do that because we've built the models from scratch, if you will.
So I really loved that explanation because I think even though you and I have worked on this for some time, it's always kind of good to kind of talk about how things are really made. So laying that foundation actually added a ton of new perspective into this second edition. And so what's new in this installment that we actually didn't include in the first one?
Sure. There's a brand new visual and analysis that I'm really excited about, and I hope readers will take in and let us know what they think of it. And it's using the Telegraph platform data for the first time. So our last installment didn't use Telegraph's own data. And here we're using it to one very specific end. We're looking at, across thousands of observations in our platform, how long did it take to go from metro area to metro area by rail? So Chicago to Los Angeles, for example, over thousands of observations. We're looking at a confidence interval around that time. So, how many hours did it take, give or take? And then we're comparing that against two benchmarks. One, how long it would take to make that same trip via truck. And two, where does that confidence interval fit compared to the Q4 2025 average? That second piece is to get a sense of what was trending faster or slower over the course of the year. So I'm really excited for readers to digest that, maybe help us improve it if they see things that we could find ways to make it even more helpful. But what we are able to do there is identify origin destination pairs that are getting increasingly competitive intermodal versus truckload. And Chicago to Los Angeles is one of those lanes highlighted for that reason in the report.
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that I've always appreciated about railroads coming out and publicly talking about their dwell numbers and train speeds being where they are is that's great. Let's actually make it super applicable. And so that's the piece that's always been missing. And so I'm glad we've kind of stepped up to the plate and are sticking our neck out and actually putting something useful in front of readers and saying rail in these lanes is getting better or more competitive relative to truck. And so when we come out and say it's a shipper's market, hey, you should evaluate over-the-road conversion, especially in a winter storm, right? There's actually some teeth behind that, but we're actually doing the hard work of measuring that. And it would be great if the railroads did that and provided that, but candidly, like they don't see across their outside of their own network. And so that's I think one of the benefits that we can really bring to the table. And thinking kind of like a little bit more about us continuing to drive to why should shippers care and how does this influence the shipper perspective? What are some of those big takeaways that you think readers will have as they think about planning their procurement decisions over the next 9 to 12 months?
Sure. Two come to mind, and I've always enjoyed our conversations on this topic as we prepare the report. So I hope you'll build upon these comments because I know I get so much out of it when you do. But I think the first one is fairly obvious in that a shipper's market means that there's a certain amount of power that confers to the shipper. The carriers want your business is another way to say that. Now, railroading is a little different than trucking. It's not as, the power dynamics are different. But I think we've seen even, with some of the customers who we've had these one-on-one conversations with, there are lanes where the railroads are really seeking out volume, and shippers who have consistent volumes, who have high volumes on these lanes, are moving commodities that are not sensitive to some of these up and downs that we've been talking about. I think ought to seize that opportunity to flex that power and get competitive rates, particularly if the rates were negotiated several years ago. As we've seen, a lot of those are higher than I think they need to be. So we hope we can, help shippers make that case with this kind of analysis. I think the second thing is, oftentimes we're talking about intermodal converting from truck to rail, but people have vast networks, so they need help identifying where the most opportune lanes to do that are, and we have some of that going here. And in a shipper's market, I think you're moving on rates and you're moving on where can I reposition my logistics decisions, perhaps moving from truck to an intermodal solution most effectively. I think we're helping people find that in this market.
Yeah, I think those are actually really two good points. It's funny, one of the things that I think now being no longer working as a railroader and being very much on the other side, it lends a certain creativity that I feel like is based in reality, but who really knows? I've oftentimes thought about if you're an intermodal marketing company or you're a railroad and you are desiring and you've said publicly and you say it every quarter in the earnings call that over the road truck to rail conversion is really the growth lever, and you've said that so many times for the past many years that I think hopefully people really believe it now. But one of the best ways to do that from a shipper standpoint, and how do you kind of really incentivize, is that railroads really benefit when there is large amounts of consistent volume. Sometimes that is just simply moving on a stack train. Sometimes that is filling a shuttle train. Whatever it is, volume really benefits the railroads. But oftentimes the undulating forecast, which is something we're talking about today, can have a real big impact when you're running effectively kind of a fixed network. And so one of the things that I've often thought about is that there are shippers or IMCs or steamship companies that can commit certain amounts of volume to the railroad over a specific period. Can they, in return for that, gain some value in rates or gain some value on a guarantee of consistency of service? And guaranteeing service is something that is very antithetical to the railroads, but candidly, that's something that you and I as consumers, and even if we were running a business and shipping packages, that some providers would offer in that space. And so going back to your point around it being a shipper's market, I think there are things that you can do. And that if you're sitting across the table from some entrepreneurial, under the gun, we've got to drive up revenue railroads, they should be willing to kind of entertain those opportunities, if nothing more in the short term, to get the numbers back to where I think people want them to be.
Yeah. Oh, totally agree. And I think some of the national level analysis we do is really just backdrop or context to those one-on-one conversations between shippers and carriers. If we see this going on nationally, we're probably part of that trend. How do we get ahead of it? How do we make our smartest decisions given that context?
Right. And that, I think that is going back to why we even started the market consist, was to really equip the broader industry with similar information and inferences and insights that they can then leverage to hopefully continue the conversion, leverage rail more, and then generally the industry should benefit from that. David, it has been an absolute blast catching up with you again. We don't do this enough. It's been really fun to talk through this kind of second edition of the Market Consist. I'm really excited about getting this up and out there. I think it's a healthy, helpful publication, and looking forward to getting some feedback from the broader environment. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat today. And for the audience, thanks for taking the time to listen.
Thank you.